In late 2013, inside an Oxfordshire headquarters, a quiet announcement ended a four-decade era of British public service computing. Research Machines, better known simply as RM, confirmed it would finally stop building its own physical computers. For decades, an RM machine was the definitive British school computer, a machine bought specifically for classrooms, lessons, and local education authorities. If you walked into a secondary school ICT room in the 1990s, you did not see generic brands. You saw a uniform fleet of beige RM Nimbus towers, thick CRT monitors, and heavy keyboards, secured by million-pound council contracts. They taught a generation of British pupils how a networked ecosystem operated. The paradox of RM was that it did not disappear because schools stopped wanting technology. It disappeared because the global market made technology too cheap. When a generic Dell in the staff room cost half the price of a bespoke RM machine in the classroom, the hardware war ended. The logo remained on school servers, but the desktop belonged to the world. But the real story of Research Machines is not only the story of a discontinued beige box. It is the story of how Britain once believed its classrooms needed a computer built on its own soil, and what happened when the rest of the world proved them wrong. Every week, we tell the stories of British machines, platforms, shops, and software houses that once taught the country what the future felt like, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story of Research Machines begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, in Oxford in 1977. In the late 1970s, the British secondary school was an entirely analog environment. A classroom operated on chalk, textbooks, exercise books, and the physical presence of a teacher. If a school possessed any advanced technology, it was usually confined to the physics laboratory, where expensive oscilloscopes and voltmeters sat carefully locked in wooden cupboards. Computing, as a concept, belonged to university research centers, government military installations, or the vast air-conditioned data centers of corporate accounting departments. The idea that a local comprehensive school might require a computer to teach children was not just financially impossible, it was culturally alien. It was into this void that Research Machines stepped, not from a high-street retail shop, but from a small office in Oxford in 1977. The company was founded by Mike Fisher and Mike O'Regan, two graduates who understood that a fundamental shift in electronics was about to occur. Microprocessors were becoming cheaper, meaning the intelligence of a room-sized mainframe could theoretically be compressed into a box that could sit on a desk. But while other early pioneers were looking at this technology and imagining a consumer product for hobbyists in their bedrooms, Fisher and O'Regan looked at it and saw a scientific instrument. They did not want to build a toy. They wanted to build a machine for education. In 1977, Research Machines launched the RM380Z. To look at it today is to understand exactly how Britain viewed early educational computing. The 380Z was not a friendly piece of beige plastic designed to sit next to a living room television. It was housed in a massive, heavy-gauge black metal case, designed to be slotted into standard 19-inch scientific equipment racks. It was a microcomputer, a machine small enough to be operated by a single person, but powerful enough to run a dedicated operating system, process complex data, and output results to a heavy CRT monitor. It looked exactly like a piece of industrial laboratory equipment, and that was entirely intentional. A British classroom could be a chaotic, destructive environment. The 380Z was built like a tank because it had to survive the secondary school science block. The machine was built around the Zilog Z80 processor, the main chip that performs calculations and executes instructions. And it was an immediate revelation for the few teachers who managed to acquire one. Before the 380Z, if a school wanted to teach computing, pupils often had to write out their code on paper, punch it onto cards, post those cards to a local university or council mainframe, and wait a week for the printed results to be posted back. With the 380Z, a pupil could type a command on a heavy mechanical keyboard and watch the result appear instantly on a glowing green screen. The feedback loop shrank from 7 days to a fraction of a second. But having a working machine was only half the battle. The problem was not just engineering, it was the ecosystem around it. To sell a school computer, Research Machines had to navigate one of the most complex purchasing systems in the country, the local education authorities. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, individual schools rarely bought their own expensive equipment. Funding was controlled by the council. Therefore, RM did not advertise heavily in consumer magazines, nor did they try to place their black metal boxes in the windows of Dixon's or local high-street electronics shops. Instead, they built a bespoke, highly specialized sales network that spoke directly to LEA purchasing officers, local government advisors, and university department heads. They offered something no retail machine could match: absolute reliability, scientific credibility, and industrial standards. While home computers like the Sinclair ZX81 were soon loading basic games from a standard cassette tape, magnetic tape used to store data cheaply through sound, the RM380Z was treating data with absolute seriousness. Schools could equip the machine with an 8-inch floppy disk drive. A floppy disk, a flexible magnetic storage medium that spun inside a protective sleeve, allowed a user to save and load programs in seconds rather than waiting for a tape to screech through its loading cycle. More importantly, the 380 series ran CP/M, which was the standard operating system for global business computing at the time. This meant that when a British 16-year-old sat in front of an RM machine, they were not just learning how to make a pixel bounce across a screen. They were learning the exact software environment used by professional programmers, accountants, and engineers. This strict adherence to professional standards gave research machines an unbreakable moat in secondary schools and higher education. By the early 1980s, the British government recognized that the country needed to prepare its youth for the digital age, launching the Microelectronics Education Program. This government initiative provided match funding to help schools buy computers. While a fierce rival named Acorn Computers captured the public imagination and dominated primary schools with the famous BBC Micro, research machines quietly tightened its grip on the older pupils. In secondary schools, colleges, and university labs across the UK, the heavy black boxes of the 380Z and later its smaller sibling, the 480Z, became the definitive hardware of British computer science. RM had successfully convinced local councils that computing was not a passing high-street fad, but a serious, necessary public service investment. But placing a single machine in the corner of a physics lab was only the beginning of the digital revolution. As the 1980s progressed, schools realized that teaching 30 pupils on one computer was impossible. The machine had proved that a classroom could hold a computer. Now it had to prove that a classroom could hold a network. By the mid-1980s, the battle to digitalize the British educational system had divided along a strict, invisible boundary. Primary schools were overwhelmingly dominated by Acorn Computers and their beloved BBC Micro. For younger pupils, Acorn's machine was perfect: bright, colorful, and equipped with a programming language that could make a mechanical turtle draw shapes on the floor. But research machines looked at teenagers, university students, and secondary school leavers, and saw a completely different requirement. Secondary school pupils did not need to play educational games. They needed to learn how to exist in a modern office. The transition began in 1985 with the launch of the RM Nimbus PC-186. If the earlier 380C was a piece of black metal laboratory equipment, the Nimbus looked like the future of corporate work. It was a beige desktop machine with a separate, heavy keyboard and a chunky CRT monitor resting on top. But the true breakthrough was not the plastic casing, it was the architecture inside. The Nimbus was a 16-bit computer, meaning its processor could handle data in larger, more complex chunks, making it significantly faster than the older 8-bit machines found in most British homes. More crucially, research machines made a cold, pragmatic decision about its operating system. The core software that manages the computer and lets other programs run. Instead of designing a quirky, bespoke British system, the Nimbus was built to run MS-DOS, the text-based operating system developed by Microsoft that was rapidly becoming the global standard for IBM-compatible personal computers. This was a pivotal moment in British tech history. While Acorn championed bespoke British brilliance, research machines quietly aligned itself with global corporate reality. When a 15-year-old pupil sat down at an RM Nimbus in 1986, they were not loading a cassette tape to play a platform game. They were using a machine that behaved exactly like the computers sitting on the desks of London accounting firms and international banks. They were typing essays on professional word processors and building spreadsheets. The machine had stopped being a curiosity and had become a vocational tool. However, supplying powerful computers to a school presented a massive logistical problem. A standard hard drive, a storage device that keeps files and operating systems even after the power is turned off, was incredibly expensive in the 1980s. A local council could not afford to put a dedicated hard drive inside 30 individual computers for a single classroom. Research machines solved this by mastering the network. An RM network, specifically RMNet, was a local area network, a physical web of thick coaxial cables that connected dozens of individual, cheaper computers back to one powerful, expensive central machine called a server. The server held all the software, all the files, and all the processing weight. For a British secondary school, this was nothing short of magic. A teacher could unlock the heavy cupboard in the corner of the ICT room, turn on the main server, and suddenly 30 beige Nimbus machines would wake up. Pupils did not need to bring fragile, floppy disks to class. They simply sat down, typed in a username, and the software traveled down the wires hidden behind the skirting boards. When they saved their GCSE coursework, they were not saving it to the machine in front of them. They were saving it to a shared drive in the corner of the room. The moment a class of 30 teenagers booted their machines simultaneously from a single RM server, computing in Britain stopped being a solitary bedroom hobby. It became a managed public utility. This network capability created an unbreakable moat for research machines. A head teacher was no longer just buying a box of electronics. They were buying a complete managed ecosystem. RM offered a single point of contact. They provided the heavy desks, the cables, the servers, the software licenses, and, most importantly, the technical support helpline. If a high street consumer wanted a computer, they went to Dixon's or a Maplin electronics shop. But RM did not need the high street. Their catalogs bypassed retail shop windows entirely and landed directly on the desks of local education authority purchasing officers. RM understood that selling technology to public institutions was not about having the fastest graphical capability or the best sound chip. It was about reliability, predictability, and control. When Acorn launched the wildly advanced Archimedes in 1987, boasting incredible graphics and a revolutionary British processor, it dazzled computer magazines and tech enthusiasts. But research machines simply pointed councils to the fact that their Nimbus network was cheaper to maintain, easier to manage, and ran the MS-DOS software that the actual adult workforce used. A school ICT room was a place of work, and RM owned the tools. By the late 1980s, the battle for the older students was largely won. Across the country, the uniform rows of beige RM screens became the definitive backdrop to British secondary education. A generation of pupils was learning how to navigate file directories, share network printers, and log into remote servers entirely within a closed ecosystem built in Oxfordshire. The classroom was no longer just a place to look at a screen. It had become an ecosystem, and research machines owned the infrastructure. By the mid-1990s, computing in Britain had moved out of the isolated physics laboratory and into dedicated, heavily air-conditioned spaces known as ICT rooms. For millions of British teenagers, this room was a defining physical environment of their education. It was a space dominated by the low, constant hum of cooling fans, the heat radiating from 30 heavy CRT monitors, deep glass screens that use cathode ray tubes to display images, and the distinct clattering sound of thick plastic keyboards. And in the vast majority of secondary schools across the country, those beige towers bore the blue RM logo. Research Machines was no longer just a hardware supplier. It had become the architect of the British digital classroom. At this point, RM was shipping its computers by the tens of thousands, securing multi-million-pound contracts with local education authorities. But RM's true power in the 1990s lay in how it controlled what the pupil actually saw on the screen. As Microsoft Windows began to dominate global desktop computing, bringing complex menus and fragile system files that a curious teenager could easily delete or corrupt, RM introduced a brilliant piece of software engineering, RM Windowbox. RM Windowbox was a bespoke user interface, the visual layout on a screen that lets a person interact with a computer, which sat securely on top of the standard Windows operating system. It hid the complex, vulnerable architecture of the computer behind a locked, colorful, and highly restricted menu system. When a pupil logged in via the RMNet server, they did not see a standard desktop. They saw a curated grid of approved software, a word processor, a spreadsheet application, an encyclopedia loaded on a shared CD-ROM drive, and perhaps a carefully vetted educational game. This was a masterpiece of institutional control. A head teacher did not want an open platform where pupils could break the operating system or load unapproved, virus-laden files from a floppy disk. They wanted a digital textbook. RM Window Box ensured that no matter what chaos a classroom of 30 teenagers attempted, the machine would reset to its pristine, locked state the next time it was turned on. In a British school where one computer network had to serve hundreds of different pupils throughout the week, the right machine did not merely run software. It decided who first saw code move on a screen, who discovered how a shared network operated, who imagined work beyond the high street, and who felt that the digital future had finally entered the classroom. This strict, controlled environment meant that RM was not just selling electronics. They were selling peace of mind to teachers who were often only one step ahead of the pupils in their own computer literacy. If a machine failed, the RM Technical Support Helpline, a dedicated service staffed by engineers in Oxfordshire, was ready to fix it. The school did not have to negotiate with a global American software giant or a generic parts supplier in Taiwan. They dealt with a British company that understood the specific, chaotic reality of a British comprehensive school. The sheer scale of this deployment created a unique, shared cultural memory. For a specific generation of British adults, the concept of a computer network is forever associated with the RM logo spinning on a screen, the slow loading bar of a shared application traveling through the coaxial cables hidden in the walls, and the synchronized click of 30 computer mice as a teacher instructed the room to open a document. The ecosystem was entirely self-sustaining. Because so many schools used RM networks, British educational software publishers specifically designed and tested their products to ensure they ran perfectly on RM Window Box. This network effect, the pattern where a platform becomes more valuable as more people and developers use it, effectively locked out foreign competitors. A generic PC manufacturer could not simply drop 30 machines into a British school and expect them to integrate seamlessly with the existing lesson plans, the server architecture, and the local council's strict purchasing rules. Research machines had built an impenetrable fortress around the British ICT room. By November 1994, the quiet operation that had begun in a small Oxford office floated on the London Stock Exchange. Research Machines was no longer just a specialist supplier. It was a publicly traded powerhouse, heavily integrated into the fabric of British public infrastructure. The company's sprawling assembly plant in Abingdon, Oxfordshire, was operating at an industrial scale. They were not fabricating their own silicon processors. They were buying standard internal components from global suppliers, but they were configuring, testing, and wrapping these parts into a strictly controlled, highly durable British ecosystem. Every beige tower that rolled off the Abingdon production line was preloaded with RM's bespoke network software, tested for the specific physical durability required by a British comprehensive school, and tagged for a massive local education authority contract. This dominance compounded when the British government launched massive public funding initiatives, such as the National Grid for Learning in the late 1990s, designed to connect every school to the internet. RM did not merely sell the physical computers to facilitate this. They became the gatekeeper to the web itself. They launched RM Internet for Learning, acting as a bespoke ISP, an internet service provider, a company that manages the physical connection to the web, exclusively for education. They provided filtered, safe internet access that blocked inappropriate content long before commercial firewalls were standard. They introduced RM EasyMail, an email platform that gave thousands of British teachers and pupils their first ever digital communication address. When standard Microsoft Windows 95 and Windows 98 arrived on the global market, bringing complex registries and fragile system files that could easily crash a shared network if mishandled by a curious teenager, head teachers clung even tighter to RM Connect. This was RM's overarching network management system that kept the classroom running. The sheer volume of RM machines meant that British educational software developers, companies making interactive encyclopedias or mathematics games on CD-ROM, explicitly tested their software to ensure it ran perfectly on RM networks first. If a software package did not work on an RM system, it effectively did not exist in the British educational market. To be a British pupil at the turn of the millennium was to experience the digital world almost entirely through an RM lens. When a teenager sat in an ICT room to research a GCSE history project, they used an RM machine, logged into an RM server, opened the RM window box interface, and searched the web through an RM-filtered internet connection. The company had achieved peak scale. The RM logo was a permanent, illuminated fixture on the heavy CRT monitors in staff rooms, libraries, and dedicated computer suites across the country. This was a monumental British success story. Research machines had proved that computing was not just a retail product to be bought in a high-street electronics shop and left to gather dust in a bedroom. They had proved it was a utility as essential to a modern school as heating, lighting, or textbooks. They had built a system that turned raw technology into a managed public service. But this entire empire rested on a delicate assumption that a school required a fundamentally different type of physical computer than a standard office. The fortress research machines had built was protected by government funding, deep local council relationships, and a highly specialized sales network. Yet beyond the school gates, a ruthless global hardware war was accelerating. American giants like Dell, HP, and Compaq were beginning to flood the consumer and corporate markets with generic, highly standardized personal computers. Because these global corporations were manufacturing machines by the tens of millions for the entire world, their supply chains were vastly more efficient than a single company assembling boxes in Oxfordshire, specifically for the British public sector. The ecosystem within the school was still secure, the software still loaded, the technical support line still rang, but the physical hardware on the desk was rapidly becoming a global commodity. Research machines had built the ultimate British classroom empire. But outside the school gates, a global hardware war was pushing prices to a level a bespoke Oxford builder could not match. By the late 1990s, the economic logic that had sustained research machines for 2 decades began to develop its first, almost imperceptible crack. In secondary school staff rooms, administrative offices, and library corners across the United Kingdom, a quiet shift was taking place. While the classroom ICT suites remained filled with beige RM towers running lockdown RM window box software, head teachers and local authorities were quietly purchasing generic, off-the-shelf personal computers from foreign competitors for administrative work. A generic desktop PC from American manufacturing behemoths like Dell, Compaq, or Hewlett-Packard cost nearly half the price of a bespoke RM machine. For years, research machines had justified its premium price tag by supplying specialized hardware, custom motherboards, and integrated educational network architecture. But as global PC manufacturing scaled up dramatically in North America and East Asia, standard component prices plummeted. Dell's direct-to-consumer model and global supply chain meant it could order microprocessors, RAM chips, and hard drives by the millions, assembling machines at a fraction of the cost incurred by an Oxfordshire factory. A school governor or head teacher reviewing a tightening annual budget was suddenly confronted with a stark financial paradox. A single RM classroom setup might cost the school $1,200 per seat, including software licenses and support, while a standard Dell Optiplex sitting in the staff room cost $600. The hardware inside both boxes was increasingly identical. Faced with this price squeeze, research machines was forced into a fateful transition. The shift from bespoke hardware engineering to commoditized system integration. RM could no longer afford to design unique internal architectures like they had with the 380i or the Nimbus PC 186. Instead, the company began sourcing standard, off-the-shelf motherboards, power supplies, and chassis from Asian manufacturers, assembling them in Abingdon and affixing the familiar blue RM badge to the front. The physical distinction between a school computer and a standard corporate PC vanished. An RM desktop in 2002 was, under the hood, essentially a generic Windows PC preloaded with RM Connect network management software. The unique industrial heritage of British classroom engineering had dissolved into a software layer running on global hardware. This transformation exposed research machines to severe financial vulnerability. When a product becomes a commodity, profit margins erode rapidly. RM was no longer competing on superior British hardware design. It was competing on price against global supply chains, operating at a scale no single UK company could ever hope to match. To protect its market share, RM leaned even harder into government-backed public sector procurement contracts. In 2004, the UK government launched Building Schools for the Future, an ambitious, multi-billion-pound infrastructure scheme designed to rebuild or refurbish every secondary school in England. On paper, this was a golden era for research machines. RM secured massive, multi-million-pound contracts to manage the complete IT infrastructure, hardware provision, and managed services for hundreds of newly built academies and comprehensive schools. However, these vast public-private contracts carried hidden structural traps. They locked RM into long-term, fixed-price service agreements that required massive capital outlay, heavy support commitments, and strict delivery deadlines. If hardware prices fluctuated, or if a school required rapid technical upgrades, RM absorbed the financial strain. Furthermore, the technological landscape inside the classroom was shifting away from the stationary desktop computer. Pupils were no longer sitting exclusively in dedicated ICT rooms facing heavy CRT monitors. Laptops, mobile carts, and early wireless networks were entering schools. The controlled static environment of 30 locked-down desktop towers connected to a central server in a locked cabinet was giving way to flexible, decentralized mobile devices. The physical RM computer, once a heavy, unyielding symbol of British public service ambition, was becoming an expensive logistical burden in a world that demanded cheap, portable, and disposable devices. The delicate balance that kept research machines assembling physical hardware in Oxfordshire finally shattered in July 2010. Following a general election, the new coalition government abruptly canceled the Building Schools for the Future program. Overnight, the massive state-funded pipeline that had guaranteed thousands of desktop PC orders for RM evaporated. Schools were suddenly told to drastically cut their budgets, and the era of the million-pound council-wide ICT infrastructure refresh was over. But even if the funding had remained, the physical reality of the classroom was already transforming. The concept of the dedicated ICT room, a heavily air-conditioned space where 30 pupils sat at 30 fixed desks staring at 30 beige towers, was beginning to look archaic. Schools wanted flexibility. They began investing in mobile laptop carts that could be wheeled into a history or science lesson. And with the arrival of reliable school-wide Wi-Fi, wireless networking technology that removed the need for the physical coaxial cables RM had mastered, the heavy, stationary desktop computer was suddenly an anchor rather than an asset. Then came a device that completely bypassed the British hardware ecosystem, the Apple iPad. Launched in 2010, the iPad popularized the touchscreen, a display that responds directly to finger input, removing the need for a separate mechanical keyboard and mouse. When head teachers looked at the iPad, they did not see a generic corporate tool. They saw an intuitive, highly portable device that a pupil could hold in their hands or take home. American consumer electronics were suddenly dictating British educational standards. Research machines attempted to adapt by selling their own branded laptops and mobile devices, but they were now fighting a war on two impossible fronts. On one side, premium American hardware like Apple was capturing the imagination of teachers. On the other side, an entirely new software paradigm was destroying RM's greatest weapon, the network server. For 2 decades, RM's moat had been its closed ecosystem. A school bought RM hardware because it needed RM Connect software to run the local server securely. But the global tech industry was rapidly moving towards cloud services, systems that store and process data on remote, internet-connected servers in massive data centers, rather than on a physical machine locked in a school cupboard. When Google introduced Google Workspace for Education in the Chromebook, a cheap, lightweight laptop designed to do nothing but run a web browser and access cloud services, the British educational technology market fundamentally changed. A school did not need to buy an expensive RM server to store pupil files, nor did they need to pay for RM's bespoke window box interface to keep the network safe. Google provided the software ecosystem for free, and any generic $200 laptop manufactured in Taiwan could access it. The unique requirement for a British school computer had finally been erased by the global internet. The bespoke operating systems, the heavy metal cases built to withstand the science block, and the local network architectures were entirely replaced by American cloud platforms and Asian manufacturing scale. The mathematics of survival no longer worked. Sourcing standard components, assembling them in the UK, branding them, and supporting them on-site could not compete with the ruthless efficiency of global commoditization. In late 2013, the inevitable announcement was made. Research Machines confirmed it would permanently close its hardware manufacturing division. The assembly lines in Abingdon, which had spent nearly 40 years defining the physical shape of British educational computing, were shut down. RM would survive, but it would pivot entirely to becoming a software and services provider, reselling generic hardware built by others. The company had not failed, but the era of the bespoke British classroom machine was officially over. The budgets tightened. The ICT suites were dismantled. The heavy monitors were recycled. The local servers were unplugged. The data moved to the cloud. The American platforms took the classroom. The factory stopped building. The logo remained on the software. The physical machine was gone. The physical machines were hauled away in council lorries, leaving behind a company that had to learn how to survive as a service rather than a shape on a desk. Today, Research Machines still exists, operating under the name RM plc. It remains a major supplier to the British education sector, but it is fundamentally a different entity from the one that built the 380Z in Oxford. RM today is an integrator, a software provider, and an IT support network. They sell broadband connections, manage cloud migrations, and provide technical services for schools. They no longer build the box. They only manage what goes through it. For many, the physical RM computer is easily dismissed as a footnote in British tech history, overshadowed by the cultural romance of the Sinclair ZX Spectrum or the beloved status of the BBC Micro. But to view Research Machines merely as an assembler of beige boxes is to misunderstand their historical weight. While Sinclair taught a generation of teenagers to write code in their bedrooms, and Acorn introduced primary school children to mechanical turtles and brightly colored educational games, RM was the industrial engine of British digital maturity. They took computing out of the hobbyist phase and turned it into a serious, managed, and necessary piece of public infrastructure. They proved that a computer in a school was not a toy, but a vocational tool. The legacy of Research Machines is not just the hardware, it is the concept of the networked classroom itself. For an entire generation of British adults, those who went through secondary school in the 1980s and 1990s, their first understanding of how a digital ecosystem operated came through an RM machine. It was on an RM Nimbus or an RM window box terminal that millions of pupils first learned how to log on to a server, how to save a file to a shared drive, and how a machine on a desk could talk to a machine in a locked cupboard. RM taught Britain the architecture of modern work. Today, the original black metal chassis of an RM 380Es or the heavy beige tower of a Nimbus PC 186 can occasionally be found in places like the National Museum of Computing at Bletchley Park. They sit behind glass, looking industrial, brutalist, and remarkably permanent compared to the disposable plastic tablets of the modern era. These machines survive to prove a very specific moment in British history. They are artifacts from an era when the United Kingdom believed it could dictate its own technological future. When a local education authority could choose a British-designed computer built in Oxfordshire, running a British-configured operating system connected by a British-engineered network. Somewhere in Britain, in the dusty, locked cupboard of an aging comprehensive school, or in the deep storage of a local council building, an old, heavy beige RM computer still sits abandoned. Its fan is silent, its network port empty, and its keyboard stiff with time. It is a machine built for a system that no longer exists, waiting for a server that was switched off decades ago, in a classroom that has long since moved its future to the cloud. See you in the next video.